I'd now like to introduce Laura Raicovich. Laura is a champion of socially engaged art practices and was the president and executive director of the Queen's Museum in New York until January this year. At the museum, she oversaw an ambitious program of exhibitions, events, and activities. She is currently writing a book about neutrality in museums, and this will be the topic of her keynote this morning. Laura has spent a decade at Dia Arts Foundation, where she was deputy director. Prior to that, she worked at Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, Public Art Fund, and New York City's Department of Parks and Recreations. Her books include Assuming Boycott, Resistance, Agency, and Cultural Production, which addresses the role of activism in culture. And I would like you to join me in welcoming Laura to the stage.
Good morning, everyone. How you doing? So I come from the United States, where we have no national cultural policy, we have no national culture minister, and we have a corrupt president. That's just for starters, but I'm here to talk to you about the myth of neutrality in cultural institutions. It's something I know a little bit about. I've worked for 20 years in the world of art, and from this vantage, see art museums and cultural institutions as microcosms of our larger society. Central to these institutions are artists and their work. And artists, particularly in times as uncertain as our own, play a crucial role in making work that influences the public imaginary with new ways of seeing, as well as how we might bring about change. I've worked in cultural organizations, large and small, with varying connections to their publics and with a diversity of financial and human resources. The common thread of each of these is their distinctive commitment to art and artists alongside the structures within which these institutions operate. As publics increase their demand for greater inclusion and diversity, cultural spaces must examine their own ways of being in order to remain relevant. I believe that to address profoundly the inequities that continue to haunt our institutions and indeed society, we could not find a better place to begin than by dismantling the myth of neutrality. Following my departure from the Queen's Museum on February 1st, 2018, I have reflected on the structures and ideologies embedded in museums and cultural institutions. Beyond the Queen's Museum, it was at Dia Art Foundation that I had the opportunity to be a part of the senior team that launched Dia Beacon, bringing Dia's collection to the public for the very first time in 2003. I saw how idiosyncratic and individual taste played a central role in creating this extraordinary, if particularly narrow, collection. Further, my work at Creative Time, the Guggenheim, and Public Art Fund gave me primary experiences working directly with artists and within institutions of significant scale and history. I kept returning to a certain set of questions. Are museums caretakers of histories and ideas? Do we look at art to try to understand our collective and culturally specific realities? Are museum spaces we access in attempts to see our present more clearly, to think about other realities, possible futures? I answer yes to all of these questions. As a seeker in the world of art, these questions are at the core of why I think museums and cultural institutions are important and why I believe they are not only central civic institutions, but also play an increasingly important role in the polarized public discourse of our times. Within museums, so many different kinds of stories are told. In art museums, they reveal the work of artists whose perspectives on the world prompt us to see things from another viewpoint, whether aesthetically, politically, formally, or socially. They open up spaces of imagination and can encourage us to bring our own life experiences into contact with poetry and with alternate ways of navigating the world. Museums also tell stories of the history of art through the lens of their own foundational realities, which are decidedly not neutral. They speak to the ways in which wealth is accumulated. They reflect that art has long been acquired in the aftermath of accrued wealth. They speak to the ways in which nations have amassed power and put it on display in a very material sense through museums. They speak of nation building, conquest, and colonialism, and they fundamentally speak to power. The power of art, its social and political power, its financial power, and its power to shift our notions of both history and the present. As institutions within society, museums are a reflection of the structures we encounter every day. They bear the same scars of division and collectivity, joy and pain, power and powerlessness, creativity and oppression that the larger society bears. This is why it's important to look deeply at cultural institutions and identify the ways in which they might become more equitable spaces, the ways they can engage audiences across racial, economic, social, cultural, linguistic, and ideological difference more intentionally than they do today. In fact, there has been a call from many quarters for museums to do just that. My most recent experiences as the director of the Queen's Museums are central to this thinking. Oh, how do I get the slide to go forward? Ah, voila. There we go. I led the museum for 3 extraordinary years. I often described it as a public museum situated within a public park. You can see the museum, see where that the blue dot is in the center? The rectangle just in front of it is the museum itself. The surrounding is Flushing Meadows Corona Park. Next to it is where they play the US Open tennis, and then the Mets play at Citi Field, which is just to the left. The city surrounds. So I often described it as a public museum situated within a public park in one of the most ethnically and culturally diverse geographies on the planet, New York City's borough of Queens. I usually include the subway map here because it shows that purple line that runs from Manhattan through Queens and to that green spot, and that's the spot that you just saw in the other slide. In a city of immigrants, Queens is the place most immigrants. Wait, why doesn't it? Sorry, it doesn't seem to be working. Yeah, I keep clicking next. Sorry. In a city of immigrants, Queens is the place most immigrants arrive via the city's 2 airports. Many stay in the string of neighborhoods along the borough's spine of the 7 train, which transports a population that speaks over 165 different languages and dialects. Each subway stop drops us into a different culture, and yet we're all New Yorkers. Intensely aware of these realities. There we go. That's a classic street view in Queens. Intensely aware of these realities, I took up my post at the Queen's Museum in January of 2015. Just 18 months later, the presidential election of Donald Trump would begin to dramatically shift the landscape. While the museum was on an upward trajectory of increased attention, support, and visibility, the results of the election deeply impacted the staff and our collaborators within the communities surrounding the museum. Over a decade before I arrived at the Queen's Museum, community organizers had been hired in a brilliant move to connect deeply with the immigrants living nearby. Led by Prerna Reddy, the Queen's Museum created a new model for how museums could engage their publics. The goal was not to bring people to the museum, but rather to leverage the resources of the museum to surface and enact the desires of these communities via cultural organizing. In the aftermath of the election of November 6, 2016, a Pandora's box of hate was unleashed, and one of its targets was and remains immigrants. Given the Queen's Museum's physical location and its history, this new reality was not at all an abstraction, but an all too harsh reality. 5% of the museum staff were beneficiaries of DACA, President Obama's executive order that provided legal status to many people brought to the United States without documents as children. This group heard President-elect Trump's promises to repeal DACA, without which they would have no status with which to work at the museum and might even face deportation. Further, in the weeks following the election, many of the people with whom the museum staff had collaborated for more than a decade and a half, for more than a decade and a half, through free family programs and at Immigrant Movement International, Corona, a community-run space that continues to operate on Roosevelt Avenue. This is the Corona Youth Orchestra. This is Immigrant Movement, which was initiated by artist Tanya Bruguera, the Queens Museum, and Creative Time, and as well as other partnerships. These are the Mujeres en Movimiento, and they are a wonderful group that grew out of IMI. And other partnerships. All of these folks now feared leaving their homes and sending their children to school. It was quite an extraordinary time. Whether or not they possessed documentation, there was the worry of being caught up in a raid or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I started getting Facebook alerts from various local groups spreading news of immigration officers being at one or another subway stop or heading to a particular neighborhood. City council members planned special sessions to reassure their constituents. Know Your Rights sessions were held at local libraries, and New York City's mayor, seen here on the right, convened a town hall meeting in Corona with then council member Julissa Ferreras, a cadre of New York City's agency heads, and local uniformed police to reassure immigrants that we're all New Yorkers. In this climate, at the Queens Museum, we started meeting weekly as a full staff to determine how to respond. We contacted immigrant rights groups to be sure to stay updated on any changes in policy. We coordinated with city agencies to be sure our staff and publics could access important information about their rights. We assembled a list of museum resources that could be lent to local groups. And importantly, we decided to collectively redraft a statement of values of the Queens Museum and join the art strike called for Inauguration Day, January 20th. These last two elements would cause some friction between me and a few members of the museum's Board of Trustees, which over the coming months would increase. On Inauguration Day, 2017, while the museum was closed to regular operations, the public was invited to work with a printmaking collective on making posters, buttons, and other ephemera for the coming protests. Over 300 people gathered in the museum's atrium that day. I was deeply moved by this gathering of retired school teachers, artists, and local moms and grandmas, some of whom thanked us repeatedly for creating a space to gather on a day they felt so vulnerable. What happened over the following 12 months is full of complexity. Several trustees did not like the fact that we were joining the Inauguration Day strike. Their position was that we should continue to do the work we had always done, but to do it quietly and avoid being seen as having taken a political stance against Trump. At least one board member feared personal retribution from Trump via tax audits of board members. I felt that this was a moment to make the Queens Museum's position clear with respect to supporting the immigrant communities that surrounded the institution, both literally and figuratively. Not only was the environment a predicament for managing staff with a significant percentage of increasingly precarious immigrants, but I also felt strongly that we needed to be forthright and direct in our support for the communities with whom we had built a great deal over the years. Trust was at issue. In parallel, the staff and I co-drafted a restatement of values that we felt would be important to buttress our work. This took the form of a letter from the director that I posted to the museum's website. In retrospect, I should have sought the board's approval before posting it, but the urgency of, of the moment made me push ahead. I presented the value statement at the next board meeting, and it was unanimously approved. Sadly, today, neither the value statement nor the letter appear on the Queens Museum's website, but I'll share with you the core points. The Queens Museum asserts a deep commitment to freedom of expression and intentionally supports and celebrates difference and multiplicity as fundamental to our collective liberation. We believe that art can shift the ways in which we experience our world, and therefore art, artists, and cultural institutions have a powerful role to play in society. Therefore, the Queens Museum advocates for art as a tool for positive social change, critical thinking, discussion and debate, discovery and imagination, and to make visible multiple histories and realities. 2, supports and initiates projects and programs that are inspired by actively listening to the needs and aspirations of the communities we serve and consider to be our valued partners. Works to engender respect for a diversity of cultures, broaden access to ideas and art, and connect the public to opportunities for civic agency. And 4, uses our resources, human, financial, environmental, and beyond, to create greater equity, inclusiveness, and sustainability, both within our institution and in the broader society. Outside of the Queen's Museum, efforts were building to create cultural responses to the incoming administration's stated agendas. Following the election, a group of artists, art workers, curators, professors, and other culturally engaged people started a Google group called Sense of Emergency. We met several times to think together about what culture could do to help counter some of the negativity coming to so many of us and the communities we hope to welcome to our spaces. An arts-based sanctuary working group formed, of which I became a member, to think through the ways in which ideas of sanctuary might be of use. We looked to the sanctuary movement of the 1980s in Latin America, largely carried out by a clergy committed to liberation theology and using churches to shelter people fleeing violence, and the new sanctuary movement of the 1990s, spearheaded by an interfaith group of leaders in the United States seeking justice for immigrants and migrants. We speculated that arts-based sanctuary could become a new form connecting with various publics to convey that cultural spaces were, in fact, for everyone. And within these spaces, there could be ways of conveying care and support. That museums themselves could help us prepare for a future of diminished fear and greater solidarity. The Queen's Museum had long histories of collaboration with frontline organizations of many kinds, including the migrant advocacy group Make the Road, Drogadictos Anónimos, and many others. If we could create a series of protocols that would allow museums and cultural spaces to make connections between audiences and frontline organizations, we could both support those feeling vulnerable as well as engender a culture of care for populations in need. Abu Farman, a professor at the New School and someone deeply involved in sanctuary, led this initiative and ultimately crafted a set of guidelines which can be found here. Oh, sorry. I'm missing a slide. Anyway, it's called Art Space Sanctuary, and you can Google it, and it'll come right up, and it'll give you all of the protocols right there. And there are many various options involved, but there's some specific ones that are required. At the time, I strongly believed, and I still do, that the Queen's Museum, given its history and the trust it had developed over the years with both community members and advocacy groups, would be an ideal organization to embrace this concept. I discussed the idea with a few trustees who enthusiastically embraced it. Buoyed, I presented it at our next board meeting. I was profoundly disappointed when some board members thought the idea completely untenable. They felt the notion of cultural sanctuary would turn the museum into a place for people to hide out or sleep, which was clearly neither the intention nor the proposal. Concerns were again raised about the optics of having the museum be seen as engaging politically against the White House at a time when it was overtly threatening sanctuary cities for undermining its immigration policies. With these outspoken voices against the initiative, it wasn't practical to move it forward, and while I was demoralized, I continued to focus on the ways we could support our publics and signal the museum's ongoing determination to actively welcome all. It was particularly encouraging when, a year ago, the New York Times profiled my work at the museum. However, some trustees were troubled by how the piece highlighted my vocal support for precarious immigrant communities and for advocating for effective engagement in the public discourse by cultural institutions. At least one trustee suggested that I not be so political on social media. While all of these discussions were taking place, the work at the Queen's Museum was increasingly being acknowledged by a broader public. We had just opened a series of successful exhibitions, including Never Built New York, which featured an array of architectural projects planned but never realized in New York City, and that received an abundant wave of positive press and new audiences. I was also deep into planning a major exhibition of artist Mel Chin's work, which you see here installed at the museum eventually. It would fill the entire Queens Museum and include major public projects that would spill into various locations throughout New York City. We had also recently received significant grants from prestigious donors, including a multi-year gift from the Mellon Foundation and funds from the Annenberg Foundation and the Luce Foundation. With these good fundraising results, we were turning a financial corner I had been working towards since my first days at the museum. There was a lot for everyone at the museum, everyone associated with the museum, to be proud of. While for me the successes of our work seemed to be piling up, I also felt a profound conflict between my ideas of how the museum should engage and support its publics, and my inability to cultivate support for these initiatives from a few key board members. As fall stretched into winter, I could no longer boomerang between these two realities and decided at the end of January to let the board chair know I wished to resign rather than renew my contract. It broke my heart to come to this conclusion because I knew I had so much more to contribute to the museum and its publics. While I hoped to work with the board to negotiate a transition that wouldn't leave the museum in a difficult position, they insisted my resignation would be effective immediately. In retrospect, I believe there were a small number of board members. I think I have another slide here. This is another image of Mel's. In retrospect, I believe there were a small number of board members out of the 26 that did not like the fact that I was determined that the museum should take a politically relevant position via its operations. I believed and continue to believe that as a cultural space reflecting our collective values, that we could not remain neutral, especially as the very foundations of democracy seemed to be crumbling, and when the publics with whom we had cultivated a sense of trust were being targeted. Neutrality, in fact, was not neutral at all, but rather a position in and of itself that went beyond supporting the status quo and veered into supporting the newly empowered in targeting our audience, our community, and our employees. And given how the museum had always operated, as well as its commitments to its own staff and collaborators, we were being confronted with realities that we could not meet with indifference. Since my departure from the Queens Museum, I've been contemplating the history of how museums came to be in the United States, how they operate today. Amidst calls for diversity and inclusion in our spaces for culture, there's no way around confronting neutrality as a persistent ideology within the museum. In a sense, the expertise of the museum is what we trust, that it selects art and makes exhibitions that are educational, that instruct us. However, there are many structures that undergird these selections and the ways in which their presentation unfolds that are directly oppositional to any desire for diversity and inclusion. The problem lies in the fact that these structures are unseen and unregistered, and that they undeniably privilege those of specific race, class, educational, and social background. If we truly want to undo barriers to inclusion, we must face this false neutrality and dismantle it. I'm currently engaged in a research initiative to unpack the myth of neutrality, to look at how it operates and identify where it is clearly problematic, as well as to understand where it may be useful, if only in the short term. To do so, I will reflect on past and recent events that highlight how these systems operate. I'm also interviewing a wide range of artists, museum insiders, cultural leaders, and critics, as well as activists with whom I've spent time discussing this notion of neutrality. And importantly, I just want to point out that I've interviewed LaTanya Autry, who with Mike Murkowski have founded a hashtag on Twitter called Museums Are Not Neutral, which is really fantastic. If you follow LaTanya, you'll find it. And they sell really fabulous T-shirts, etc. And they also have a great bibliography about neutrality. So thus far, all of the stories that I've heard are deeply revealing about how embedded this notion of neutrality is within the culture of culture. What also comes to light is that it's often during times of conflict that the invisibility of neutrality becomes most poignant. Take, for example, the recent invitation I received about an event at the Metropolitan Museum of Art that featured scholars from the Middle East discussing their research. After the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, the museum made a decision not to use funding from Saudi Arabia to support the convening and distributed an email to the convening's audiences to make that clear. Similarly, the call for the Tate's divestment from BP sponsorship following calls from various quarters altered how... Oh, okay. I'm almost finished. I'm almost through. And beyond funding sources, the conflict that arose around the painter Dana Schutz's contribution to the last Whitney Biennial is particularly important. Many African Americans objected to her depiction of the body of Emmett Till, a young black man murdered during the Civil Rights era in the United States. These points of conflict are helpful, not only in making the myth of neutrality visible as an impossible idea, but also because we can use them to foster a greater civic discourse. If we are open to them, these moments can help us make a better museum and a better civil society. Perhaps it is stating the obvious that museums serve many publics. No matter whether they are funded publicly or privately, they are spaces we hold in common for the common good. In the increasingly privatized public spaces of our parks and surveilled streets, not to mention the political and economic gulfs that are ever widening, is it not essential to have spaces that are explicitly held in common? Could that space be a museum? How would that space function? What would it look like? Would it continue to be a museum? So the question remains, how do we struggle together to create art spaces that are truly equitable? To help guide this discussion forward, like any good museum professional, I'll borrow from the thinking of a brilliant artist, Jonas Stahl. He has proposed, in relationship to a recent project, that we reclaim the idea of propaganda from those who use it to consolidate power and influence to benefit only a few already powerful people. What would happen if we together imagined and then enacted emancipatory propagandas, which rather than further concentrating power could construct new spaces, the goals of which would be inclusion and justice? Can we produce propagandas in which we seek mutual liberation? And given the museum's centrality in telling the many stories of our past and desires for the future, couldn't the museum be a key space to cultivate these emancipatory propagandas? After all, if we are museum professionals who present great art to the public, and the art itself has powerful, multiple stories to tell, I can certainly envision ways to craft museum experiences that impart an evolving story of our histories, ideals, dreams, present realities, and the poetry of art, all the while being a center for inclusive civic life. Thank you.